My heart went cold when I saw the empty sacks in the barn. Not because of the loss, but because I knew who had done it. The feeling of violation went all the way to the roots of my hair. And then, without waiting long, she appeared triumphantly, pointing at the barn, her mouth pouring out heavy accusations as if she were the victim. Both theft and slander, an unflinching reversal. She believed that her title was enough to cover her sin. But what she didn't know, each sack she greedily carried away held within it the evidence that would bring it all down. Before the chaos began, Meadowbrook was a quiet neighborhood where I had lived peacefully for 15 years. My days were simple, tending 20 acres of wheat, wearing the same red and blue plaid shirt and old cowboy hat. My neighbors knew me as a quiet guy who sold grain to local mills. I was Jake Thompson, 47, a lifelong farmer who had no interest in trouble, until Sarah Martinez arrived. At 38, with perfectly styled short curly blonde hair and a wardrobe of sharp black and white suits, she had come to our community and was elected HOA president within weeks. In her zealous spirit, she promised to improve property values, but her crusade soon became personal. And somehow, I became her first target in a 6-month war that would rock the entire neighborhood. But why would Sarah target me, a peaceful farmer who just wants to live quietly and tend to his modest backyard garden? The answer would soon become clear, and it had everything to do with power, control, and a fundamental misunderstanding about what was really in those brown sacks in my barn. What started as a simple delivery of organic fertilizer would escalate into the biggest neighborhood drama Meadowbrook had ever seen. The conflict started on a crisp October morning when I hauled home a truckload of dried cow manure for composting fertilizer. I'd been buying this organic gold from Miller's farm for years, knowing it would make my tomatoes and corn grow like they were on steroids. The delivery truck rumbled down our quiet street, and I directed the driver to stack the 50-pound sacks in my barn, same as always. But this time, I had an audience I didn't know about. Sarah saw those brown burlap sacks being unloaded, and her eyes lit up like she'd discovered buried treasure. Within 2 hours, I found a crisp white envelope in my mailbox containing the first warning letter. Commercial activities not permitted in residential areas. Immediate cessation required. The letter was typed on official HOA letterhead, with more legal jargon than a Supreme Court ruling. When I knocked on her door that evening to explain this was just fertilizer for my backyard garden, Sarah stood in her doorway like a fortress guard, arms crossed, blonde curls practically vibrating with suspicion. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice dripping with the authority of someone who just discovered they had power over others, "I wasn't born yesterday. Those are clearly grain sacks, and I have photographic evidence of your commercial wheat operation." She waved a manila folder thick with what I assumed were photos of my truck. "I'm giving you 72 hours to cease and desist all commercial activities." When I politely declined her demand to inspect my barn, explaining it was private property, Sarah's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. "We'll see about that," she hissed, and I knew this was just the beginning. The tension escalated faster than a rocket launch when Sarah began what she called her comprehensive investigation into my alleged criminal activities. She hired a private detective, a Weasley little man named Rick, who drove a beat-up sedan and thought he was invisible while following my bright red pickup truck around town. Every morning at 5:30, I'd see Rick parked across the street, camera lens glinting in the early sunlight, documenting my every move like I was running a drug cartel instead of hauling wheat to the grain elevator. Sarah then declared at the next HOA meeting, held in Mrs. Patterson's living room with 20-odd neighbors crammed together like sardines, that I was illegally transporting wheat and turning our peaceful residential community into a commercial warehouse district. She had prepared a PowerPoint presentation that would have made a Fortune 500 CEO proud, complete with aerial photos of my property that she had somehow obtained and red arrows pointing to my barn like it was a missile silo. The first major conflict erupted when Sarah started fining me amounts that would make a loan shark blush. Week 1 brought a citation for $200 because my truck was parked on the street longer than the legally permitted duration of 4 hours. I'd literally stopped to unload groceries. Week 2 delivered a $500 fine for early morning noise violations because I started my truck at 6 a.m. to head to the fields. A citation noted that excessive diesel engine noise before 7 a.m. constitutes a breach of community peace standards. Week 3 brought the mother lode, a $1,000 fine for odor violations stemming from improperly stored agricultural materials. This was particularly ridiculous because the dried cow manure had been properly composted and sealed, producing about as much smell as a bag of potting soil. I was starting to realize that Sarah had declared war, and she was using the HOA rulebook as her weapon of mass destruction. The situation turned from annoying to downright Orwellian when Sarah formed what she grandly called the Special Oversight Committee for Community Standards Enforcement. This committee consisted of 3 of her closest friends: Janet Morrison, a retired librarian who treated every minor rule violation like a federal crime; Bob Fletcher, an accountant who measured his grass with a ruler to ensure it met the optimal height requirements; and Patricia Williams, a woman who had once called the police because her neighbor's dog barked twice in one afternoon. This unholy trinity began conducting what they called neighborhood patrols, but what felt more like surveillance operations. Every morning, I'd see them standing at the edge of my property line with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes, documenting everything from the angle of my mailbox to the number of newspapers in my driveway. Some days I'd catch them standing by my fence, actually counting the sacks in my barn through the gaps in the wooden slats, whispering among themselves like they were planning a military operation. The third major escalation occurred when Sarah decided to take our neighborhood dispute to the authorities. She filed a formal complaint with the county tax assessor's office, claiming I was operating an undeclared commercial grain storage facility and therefore owed thousands in back taxes. She contacted the fire department, insisting that my barn contained highly flammable agricultural materials stored in violation of safety codes. She even called the police, reporting suspicious commercial activity in a residential zone. This bureaucratic bombardment forced me to take entire days off work to meet with various officials, explaining over and over that I was a simple wheat farmer with some dried manure for my garden. The fire chief, a reasonable man named Captain Rodriguez, actually laughed when he inspected my barn and realized what Sarah was complaining about. "Mr. Thompson," he said, shaking his head, "I've seen some petty neighbor disputes in my time, but this lady's got a real imagination." The peak of Sarah's oppression campaign came when she decided to take our dispute public in the most dramatic way possible. She organized a press conference at the community center, complete with rented folding chairs, a podium borrowed from the local church, and even a banner she'd had professionally printed. Local reporters showed up, probably expecting some major municipal corruption scandal, only to find Sarah pointing dramatically at blown-up photographs of my barn. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the gravity of someone announcing the end of the world, "I have uncovered a conspiracy to transform our peaceful residential neighborhood into an industrial agricultural zone." She had prepared a presentation that would have impressed a Pentagon briefing, complete with aerial maps, traffic flow charts, and what she called photographic evidence of systematic commercial grain distribution. The local newspaper reporter looked confused, but Sarah pressed on, casting me as some sort of agricultural supervillain, threatening the very fabric of suburban life. The fourth conflict really pushed me to my breaking point, when Sarah launched what could only be described as a social warfare campaign. She began systematically turning my neighbors against me through a combination of fear-mongering and social pressure that would have made a political operative proud. She convinced the Martinez family that my commercial activities were lowering their property values. She told the Johnsons that my morning truck starts were giving their babies sleep problems. She even managed to persuade Mrs. Chen that the smell from my barn was triggering her allergies, despite the fact that she lived 4 houses away. The social isolation became almost unbearable when Sarah convinced the neighborhood mothers to stop letting their children play with my grandson Tommy during his weekend visits. 8-year-old Tommy couldn't understand why his friends suddenly weren't allowed to come over, why birthday party invitations stopped coming, why the other kids avoided him at the community pool. Watching my grandson's confusion and hurt was like a knife to my heart, and I realized Sarah had crossed a line from annoying neighbor to genuine threat to my family's well-being. In the final weeks leading up to the barn confrontation, Sarah's behavior became increasingly unhinged and aggressive. She hired a lawyer, some slick downtown type in a $1,000 suit, who sent me threatening letters about maintaining community standards and legal consequences for continued violations. She organized what she called concerned citizen meetings, where neighbors gathered to discuss the Jake Thompson problem, like I was some sort of natural disaster that needed to be managed. Sarah's crowning achievement was convincing the HOA board to pass an emergency resolution giving her enhanced enforcement powers to deal with persistent violators. This basically meant she could fine me, inspect my property, and generally make my life miserable with the full backing of the community organization. What she didn't realize was that throughout this entire 6-month campaign of harassment, I had been quietly documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to reveal who I really was and what I really knew about the law. What Sarah didn't know, what none of my neighbors knew, was that Jake Thompson, the simple wheat farmer, was actually Jake Thompson, the former state agricultural inspector. For 12 years before I started farming, I had worked for the Colorado Department of Agriculture, investigating everything from grain elevator fraud to illegal pesticide use. I knew agricultural law better than most lawyers, understood property rights like a constitutional scholar, and had spent years learning how to build ironclad legal cases against people who thought they could abuse their authority. I had been letting Sarah dig her own grave, documenting every illegal fine, every improper inspection, every abuse of HOA power. I knew exactly when she had crossed from annoying neighbor into criminal territory, and I was just waiting for her to give me the perfect opportunity to spring my trap. That opportunity came on a cold February morning when Sarah finally decided to take matters into her own hands and conduct her own inspection of my barn. Right after Sarah and her 3-man enforcement team left my barn in confusion, having discovered that the smell definitely wasn't wheat, I walked calmly into my house and made the phone call I'd been planning for months. Marcus Rodriguez Law Office, came the familiar voice of my old friend's receptionist. Please, tell him Jake Thompson is ready to move forward with the Meadowbrook situation. Marcus Rodriguez had been my legal advisor during my inspector days, a sharp lawyer who specialized in agricultural law and property rights. When I'd first told him about Sarah's harassment campaign 3 months earlier, he'd advised patience. Let her hang herself, Jake, he'd said. Document everything, stay calm, and when she finally goes too far, we'll have an airtight case. Well, breaking into my barn with unauthorized personnel definitely qualified as going too far. Within 48 hours, Marcus had completed what he called a comprehensive legal review of Sarah's entire 8-month reign of terror. The results were even more damning than I'd hoped. Jake, this woman has violated so many laws I don't know where to start, Marcus told me over coffee at Miller's Diner. First, she unilaterally modified the HOA bylaws without proper homeowner notification or approval. Under Colorado law, any changes to HOA governing documents require a 30-day notice period and a majority vote of all homeowners, not just board members. The illegal fines were just the tip of the iceberg. She's been charging you $500 to $1,000 per violation, Marcus continued, spreading documents across the table like a poker dealer. But the most serious discovery was Sarah's use of HOA funds for personal vendettas. She spent $15,000 of community money on private investigators, legal fees, and that ridiculous press conference, Marcus explained, his voice rising with professional outrage. That's embezzlement, pure and simple. In Colorado, misappropriation of homeowners association funds is a felony punishable by up to 6 years in prison and full restitution. The second phase of my counterattack involved an unexpected ally, David Martinez, Sarah's own husband. 3 days after the barn incident, David appeared at my door looking like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Jake, I owe you an apology, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and shame. My wife has lost her mind with this HOA power trip and I can't stand it anymore. David revealed that he'd been trying to rein in Sarah's behavior for months, but she'd become obsessed with what she called maintaining community standards. She spends hours every day taking pictures of neighbors' houses, measuring grass heights, timing how long people park on the street, he told me, shaking his head in disbelief. Last week, I found her going through our financial records, trying to find ways to use our personal money to fund more investigations into you and other neighbors. More importantly, David agreed to provide crucial evidence of Sarah's conspiracy. I have copies of all her emails to the Oversight Committee, he said, pulling out a thick folder. Jake, you need to see what she's been writing about you. She's been planning this whole campaign like it's some kind of military operation. The emails were even worse than I'd imagined, filled with phrases like total neighborhood elimination of the Thompson problem and escalated enforcement until voluntary relocation occurs. My third ally emerged from the most unexpected source, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, the 78-year-old widow who lived in the corner house and kept to herself most of the time. Helen had always struck me as a sweet old lady who minded her own business, so I was shocked when she knocked on my door carrying a shoebox full of what she called evidence. Jake, honey, Helen said in her soft grandmother voice, I've been watching that horrible woman terrorize this neighborhood for months, and I've been documenting everything. She opened the shoebox to reveal dozens of photographs, a detailed journal, and several USB drives. I may be old, but I'm not blind. I've been taking pictures every time Sarah and her little gang trespass on people's property, and I've got video footage of things that would make your hair curl. Helen's evidence was a goldmine of Sarah's illegal activities. She had documented at least 15 instances of Sarah entering neighbor yards without permission, photographs of the oversight committee going through people's trash looking for evidence of violations, and recordings of Sarah's phone calls where she discussed plans to make life so unpleasant for certain residents that they'll have no choice but to move. And the breaking point for me, Helen continued, was when I saw what she did to poor Mr. Foster. Gerald Foster was an 82-year-old World War II veteran who lived alone in a small house he'd owned for 40 years. Helen's photographs showed Sarah and her committee measuring Mr. Foster's fence, documenting minor maintenance issues, and essentially harassing the old man for violations that didn't exist. He's been threatening to fine him into bankruptcy unless he sells his house to some development company, Helen revealed, her gentle voice hardening with anger. Jake, that poor man fought in the Pacific Theater, survived the Depression, and raised 6 children in that house. If Sarah thinks she can bully him out of his home, she's got another thing coming. Armed with this evidence, I was ready to launch the final phase of my counterattack. I contacted Tom Bradley, investigative reporter for Channel 7 News, whom I'd worked with during several high-profile agricultural fraud cases during my inspector days. "Tom, remember that grain elevator embezzlement case we worked on 5 years ago?" I said when he answered his phone. "Well, I've got something even better for you. How would you like to expose the biggest HOA corruption scandal this state has ever seen?" Tom was immediately interested, especially when I mentioned the embezzlement angle and the harassment of elderly residents. "Jake, this sounds like exactly the kind of story our viewers love," he said enthusiastically. "Corrupt officials, abuse of power, small-town David versus Goliath. When can we meet?" We arranged to meet the following day to review all the evidence and plan what Tom called the most satisfying takedown interview of my career. But before we could execute our media strategy, Sarah made a critical error that would accelerate her downfall faster than we'd planned. Feeling pressure from increasing neighbor complaints, and probably sensing that her authority was being questioned, Sarah decided to organize what she called an emergency community meeting to deal with what she termed the ongoing Thompson crisis and final resolution thereof. The meeting invitation, delivered to every house in the neighborhood, was a masterpiece of dramatic overstatement. It promised definitive action regarding ongoing commercial violations, community voting on enhanced enforcement measures, and final resolution of persistent neighborhood disruption issues. Reading between the lines, it was clear that Sarah intended to use this meeting to rally community support for either fining me into bankruptcy or somehow forcing me to move. What she didn't realize was that she was about to walk into the perfectly prepared trap that would end her reign of terror once and for all. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at 7 p.m. in the Meadowbrook Community Center, a modest building that usually hosted bingo nights and children's birthday parties. By 6:30, cars were lined up down the street as nearly 200 residents showed up, the largest community gathering in our neighborhood's 20-year history. Word had spread that this meeting would finally resolve the ongoing drama between Sarah Martinez and me, and nobody wanted to miss the fireworks. Sarah had transformed the community center into what looked like a courtroom, complete with a raised platform where she'd placed a podium borrowed from the local Methodist church. She'd rented a professional projection system, arranged folding chairs in perfect rows, and even hung a banner reading Meadowbrook Community Standards Enforcement across the back wall. The whole setup screamed of someone who had spent considerable time and money trying to look official and intimidating. At exactly 7 p.m., Sarah called the meeting to order with a wooden gavel she'd purchased for the occasion. "Fellow residents of Meadowbrook," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who genuinely believed she was saving civilization itself. "We gather tonight to address the most serious threat our community has faced in its entire existence. Jake Thompson has systematically violated every principle of responsible neighborhood living, and tonight we take definitive action." For the next 25 minutes, Sarah delivered a presentation that would have impressed a prosecuting attorney. She had prepared dozens of PowerPoint slides showing aerial photographs of my property, traffic pattern analyses documenting my truck's movements, and what she called photographic evidence of systematic commercial grain storage and distribution operations. She displayed charts showing declining property values that she attributed to my industrial activity, and even presented testimony from neighbors about noise complaints and quality of life disruptions. "The evidence is overwhelming and irrefutable," Sarah declared, pointing dramatically at a slide showing my barn. "Jake Thompson has transformed residential property into commercial warehouse space, violating zoning laws, HOA regulations, and basic community standards. Tonight, we vote to impose maximum fines, demand immediate cessation of all commercial activities, and if necessary initiate legal proceedings to force compliance or removal. Scattered applause came from Sarah's Special Oversight Committee and a handful of neighbors who had been convinced by months of propaganda. But I noticed that most of the audience looked uncomfortable, skeptical, and in some cases downright annoyed. Helen Rodriguez was sitting in the front row, shaking her head. David Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, and several neighbors were whispering among themselves with expressions that suggested they weren't buying Sarah's dramatic presentation. When Sarah asked, "Does anyone have questions or comments before we proceed to the vote?" I stood up slowly, coffee mug still in hand, from my dinner at home. The entire hall fell silent except for the humming of the projection equipment. I walked calmly to the front of the room, pulled a USB drive from my shirt pocket, and addressed the crowd with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years presenting evidence in legal proceedings. "Thank you, Sarah, for organizing this meeting and giving me the opportunity to address these serious accusations," I began, my voice carrying easily through the room without any need for dramatic gestures or raised volume. "I think it's important that our community have all the facts before making any decisions about my alleged crimes against suburban civilization. First," I continued, plugging my USB drive into Sarah's projection system, "let's address the central accusation that I'm operating an illegal commercial wheat storage facility." The screen filled with photographs I'd taken that morning of the contents of my barn. I invite Sarah and anyone else who's interested to come to my house right now, tonight, after this meeting, to inspect those brown sacks that have caused so much concern. But what you'll find is approximately 2 tons of dried, composted cow manure that I purchased from Miller's Farm to fertilize my backyard vegetable garden. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd as the reality of the situation began to dawn on people. Sarah's face was turning an interesting shade of red, but she remained defiant. "That's obviously a recent substitution," she declared. "He's clearly moved the wheat to another location and replaced it with whatever that is." Second, I continued without acknowledging Sarah's outburst, "I'd like to share some information about how our HOA has been managed over the past 8 months. The screen changed to display detailed spreadsheets showing every fine that had been imposed during Sarah's presidency. According to Colorado Revised Statutes Title 38, homeowners associations are limited to fines of $50 for initial violations and no more than $200 for repeat violations. However, our current president has been imposing fines ranging from $500 to $1,500, which violates state consumer protection laws. The murmuring in the audience grew louder as neighbors began calculating how much they'd been illegally overcharged. Mrs. Patterson called out, "She fined us $800 for having our garbage cans visible from the street." Mr. Chen added, $1,200 because our fence was supposedly 6 inches too tall. "Third," I said, changing slides to show bank records that Marcus had helped me obtain through legal discovery processes, "I have documentation showing that our HOA president has spent over $18,000 of community funds on personal projects including private investigators, legal fees for her personal disputes, and tonight's theatrical presentation. Under Colorado law, this constitutes embezzlement of homeowners association funds, which is a felony." The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors realized their monthly HOA fees had been funding Sarah's personal vendetta. "Where's our money going?" someone shouted. "She never asked permission for any of this," called another voice. "Fourth," I continued, my voice remaining calm despite the growing chaos, "I have video evidence of systematic trespassing and harassment of multiple families in our neighborhood." Helen Rodriguez's carefully documented footage began playing, showing clear violations of property rights that would make any lawyer salivate. The videos showed Sarah and her committee entering yards without permission, going through trash and intimidating elderly residents. At this point, Tom Bradley appeared at the back of the room with his Channel 7 News camera crew. "Good evening, everyone," Tom announced, his professional broadcaster voice cutting through the noise. "I'm Tom Bradley from Channel 7 Investigative News. We're here following reports of serious HOA misconduct and would like to get statements from community members about these allegations." Sarah looked like a deer caught in headlights, suddenly realizing that her carefully orchestrated public relations coup was turning into a public relations disaster of epic proportions. This is an illegal intrusion," she stammered. "This is a private community meeting." "Actually, Ms. Martinez," Tom replied smoothly, "OA meetings are required by law to be open to homeowners and in cases involving potential criminal activity to the press. Now, would you care to comment on these allegations of embezzlement and harassment?" "Finally," I said, reclaiming the room's attention, I need to address the most serious accusation against our HOA president. The screen changed to show documentation of Sarah's threats against Gerald Foster. Mrs. Martinez has been systematically harassing Mr. Foster, an 82-year-old World War II veteran, attempting to force him to sell his property to a development company in which she holds financial interest. This constitutes abuse of fiduciary duty, elder abuse, and potentially racketeering under federal law. Gerald Foster himself stood up slowly, his old frame shaking with emotion. "That woman threatened to fine me into bankruptcy if I didn't sell my house," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived both war and the Great Depression. "I fought in the Pacific for 3 years, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be driven out of my own home by some power-hungry bureaucrat." The community center exploded with angry voices, people standing up and shouting questions and accusations. David Martinez stepped forward, his face pale with shame and determination. "I can't let this continue," he announced, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "My wife has violated her oath of office, misused community funds, and brought disgrace to our neighborhood. I'm formally requesting an immediate vote of no confidence." Sarah made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "You're all being manipulated," she screamed over the chaos. "This is a coordinated attack by someone who refuses to follow basic community standards." But her voice was lost in the crowd of angry neighbors who had finally realized they'd been played for fools by someone they'd trusted with authority. The vote of no confidence was conducted immediately, with every homeowner present casting their ballot in a cardboard box borrowed from the community center's storage room. The results were announced by Mrs. Patterson, who had been elected as temporary parliamentarian, 189 votes to remove Sarah Martinez from office, with only 4 votes in opposition, likely from her oversight committee members. Tom Bradley captured the entire dramatic conclusion on camera, interviewing neighbors about their experiences with Sarah's harassment and documenting the community's unanimous rejection of her leadership. "Mr. Thompson," Tom asked me as the crowd was dispersing, "what would you say to other homeowners who might be facing similar abuse from their HOA leadership?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the families who might be watching this broadcast while dealing with their own neighborhood tyrants. Know your rights, document everything, and never let anyone use a position of authority to intimidate you into giving up your legal protections. The law is on the side of property owners, not power-hungry officials who forget they're supposed to serve their community, not rule it. But the story was far from over. What happened in the weeks and months following Sarah's dramatic downfall would transform Meadowbrook from a neighborhood divided by fear and suspicion into a model community that other HOAs would study and emulate. Within 72 hours of the emergency meeting, Sarah Martinez and her family had vanished from Meadowbrook like they'd never existed. The moving trucks arrived at dawn on Monday morning, and by sunset their house was empty, except for a few pieces of furniture, too damaged or worthless to take. David Martinez left a handwritten note taped to every front door in the neighborhood, apologizing for his wife's behavior and including a check to reimburse each family for illegal fines they'd pay. The legal consequences for Sarah were swift and severe. The Colorado Attorney General's office filed criminal charges including embezzlement of homeowners association funds, abuse of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse for her treatment of Gerald Foster. The potential prison sentence ranged from 4 to 8 years depending on how many charges resulted in convictions. Additionally, she faced 17 separate civil lawsuits from neighbors seeking damages for harassment, illegal fines, and emotional distress. Tom Bradley's investigative report aired as a 3-part series titled "Oh Hell, When Neighbors Become Dictators," and the story went viral nationally. My quote about never underestimating a farmer who knows the law became an internet meme, showing up on social media posts and protest signs at HOA meetings across the country. The story inspired similar investigations in dozens of other communities where homeowners had been suffering under abusive HOA. The Meadowbrook community wasted no time in organizing new leadership elections. By unanimous vote, they asked me to serve as interim president while new bylaws were written and permanent officers elected. I accepted the position with the understanding that my primary goal was creating a system of checks and balances that would prevent anyone from ever again accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Sarah had abused. Our first order of business was establishing what we called the Meadowbrook Accountability Framework, a comprehensive set of reforms that included mandatory financial audits, limits on presidential authority, required community approval for any expenditure over $100, and a citizen oversight board with the power to investigate complaints and remove officers for misconduct. Every decision had to be transparent, every expenditure had to be justified, and every homeowner had access to all HOA records and financial information. We also created the Community Legal Defense Fund, using the money recovered from Sarah's embezzlement and the proceeds from selling the ridiculous enforcement equipment she'd purchased with community funds. This fund provides free legal consultation for any homeowner who feels their rights are being violated, ensuring that nobody would ever again face the kind of legal intimidation that Sarah had used as her primary weapon. Gerald Foster became something of a neighborhood hero, and his story inspired us to establish special protections for elderly and disabled residents. We created a senior support network that provides assistance with home maintenance, yard work, and bureaucratic issues, ensuring that nobody could ever again be bullied into selling their home because they couldn't keep up with arbitrary standards or afford excessive fines. Ellen Rodriguez was elected to the new oversight board, where her natural nosiness became a valuable asset in keeping community leaders honest. "I've been watching neighbors for 50 years, she told the local newspaper, and now I finally have official permission to be a busybody." Her documentation skills, which had been crucial in building the case against Sarah, now help ensure that every community meeting is properly recorded and every decision is fully documented. The transformation of Meadowbrook attracted attention from urban planning researchers, legal scholars studying HOA governance, and community organizers looking for models of effective neighborhood self-management. We started receiving visitors from other communities seeking advice on HOA reform, and I found myself giving presentations at conferences about property rights and community leadership. My barn, meanwhile, had become an unlikely tourist attraction. The sacks of cow manure that had started this whole drama were still there, still composting peacefully, still producing the rich fertilizer that made my vegetable garden the envy of the neighborhood. I hung a small plaque next to the barn door, reading "The Manure That Saved Meadowbrook," and visitors often asked to take pictures with the infamous sacks that had brought down a neighborhood dictator. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Sarah's obsession with controlling every aspect of community life had ultimately led to the creation of the most democratic and transparent HOA governance system in the state. Her attempts to concentrate power in her own hands had resulted in a system where power was so distributed and limited that no future leader could ever again abuse their position the way she had. Tom Bradley won a regional Emmy Award for his investigative series, and he still visits occasionally to do follow-up stories about how Meadowbrook has thrived under its new governance model. Property values actually increased after Sarah's departure, as word spread that our neighborhood had solved the HOA abuse problem that plagued so many other communities. As for me, I continue farming my wheat, tending my vegetables, and serving the community in a way that focuses on service rather than control. Every morning when I walk past my barn and smell the earthy richness of composting cow manure, I'm reminded that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that others overlook or misunderstand. The story of Meadowbrook has become a case study in how communities can reclaim their power from abusive leadership, how ordinary citizens can use legal knowledge and patience to overcome institutional bullying, and how the truth always emerges when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. But most importantly, it's a story about how a simple misunderstanding about the contents of some brown sacks led to the discovery that our neighborhood's biggest problem wasn't commercial wheat storage. It was an abundance of a different kind of organic material altogether. In the end, Sarah Martinez learned the hard way that when you try to rule through fear and intimidation, you eventually encounter someone who knows more about the rules than you do. And sometimes that someone is just a quiet farmer who understands that the best fertilizer comes from patience, proper preparation, and letting natural processes take their course. Whether you're growing tomatoes or growing justice, the same principles apply. Give it time, tend it carefully, and eventually you'll harvest exactly what you planted.